Hello. See, I'm going to talk about Alexander Hamilton, who become popular uh, over the last few years due to a play, a Hamilton play. Now, Hamilton himself was not necessarily a good person. Like, he was basically potentially one of the worst people that ever lived in America. I mean, there's this new play. It's like came out of New York, I guess. Has a famous actor, and maybe he's a writer. I'm not sure, but it, I, as far as I can gather, tends to make Hamilton a hero. And I think they partly did that based on the fact that he voiced some opposition to slavery at some point and owned less slaves maybe than some of the other founders. I don't know. I think that's the angle that they're going with, which tends to be the angle for Hamilton apologists in historiography and biography and whatever. Hamilton, and I used to kind of go in for it. Like, I used to take more of a nuanced position with Hamilton, where I thought that, or even seeing him as good, and as basically buying into the arguments in favor of him back when I was first looking into the history. Basically, the idea that he was anti-slavery, and I feel like the people who are his apologists, who are promoting him, they just try to kind of use inference, or like try to make people think that, without necessarily saying it directly, but just trying to make people suspect that it was his anti-slavery politics which separated him from the Jeffersonians, which I think couldn't be further from the truth. Like, if anything, there were probably more anti-slavery people, or at least as many, among the Jeffersonians. But yeah, I'd say probably more so. There were probably more anti-slavery people among the Jeffersonians than among the Hamiltonians. So the actual guy Hamilton, I have not, read about this for years, decades or something. So, but but based on what I can recall, Hamilton was born in the Caribbean, maybe in like St. Kitts and Nevis, or not sure exactly where in the Caribbean. And his father was a Scottish, maybe either the second or third or fourth son of a Scottish laird, Scottish, large landholder. I mean, not large landholder on the level of like a duke or an earl or something, but I think a fairly substantial landholder. somewhere. I think uh, potentially maybe in Ayrshire. Um, I think they were from southwest Scotland. So anyway, but he was also called. He was maligned by some of his opponents as being the quote unquote bastard son of a Scotch peddler. So it may be that because of primogeniture and the patrilinear descent, that only like the first son basically inherited everything back in Scotland, and then the rest were kind of left to shift for themselves. And so he may have become a peddler or merchant or something. That was very normal for Scots abroad to take up trade. And then he married a Huguenot. This is, Alexander Hamilton's father married a Huguenot. Either, I'm not sure if they met in the Caribbean. I'm guessing they did, but maybe beforehand. She might have had other elements in her ancestry, but the main one I know of is that I think a Huguenot French, like Protestant, or maybe a French Catholic, but I'm pretty sure she was of French ancestry. So he grew up there in the Caribbean. Then he wanted to go to Princeton. I think it may have been called just called the College of New Jersey at that time, which was a pretty new but pretty renowned school, especially among evangelicals. And anyway, he wanted to go there. I think he sent a letter to the president of the school, Mr. Witherspoon, who himself was Scottish, was from Scotland, and trying to gain admittance, whatever. And I think Witherspoon was of the opinion that Hamilton was still too young. I think he was maybe he was like 16 or something at this time, 17, I'm not really sure. So anyway, Hamilton took this as a slight, and he, I think, went instead to maybe he went to King's College in New York. Not sure actually where he ended up going, but it might have been King's College, New York. Anyway, he, I think he was an aide to George Washington. So as an aide to Washington, he kind of gained, experience and connections. And he was basically in battle. So, I think he was considered to be as good as anybody as a soldier, as far as I know. But the politics came in where basically, I'm not really sure his politics during the war. I'm sure he was probably part of the more conservative branch of New York Whigs. But yeah, he kind of comes to prominence after the revolution is over, and he basically like the Constitution is his brainchild. He basically, there was we fought the revolution, we got independence, but the elites, the wealthy people in the US basically kept such a stranglehold on power that there was no real democracy won, especially in states like in Massachusetts, where it had been the, inland Presbyterian Ulster Scots who had borne a lot of the brunt of a lot of the battles, but they were basically shut out of power after the revolution by the coastal counties, like by I think Essex, and I think there was like 3 counties in eastern Massachusetts that controlled the rest of the state. And they actually, under John Adams, created a constitution during the revolution, like around, I don't know if it was 1776, 1777, probably later, probably at least 1778 or 9, that they created a new constitution. I mean, I think there were actually a few incarnations, maybe. Like first they abridged the charter, but the upshot of it was like they decreased the franchise from what it was before the revolution. Like, so they made it so less people were allowed to vote. Like before the revolution, I think you had to have like maybe, I don't know, maybe you had to have 200 acres or 200 pounds sterling, or I don't know, whatever it is. And I mean, which is already terrible and egregious, right? But during the revolution, John Adams and his Eastern, plutocrats further restricted it. So then you needed like 400 acres, or, I'm not sure if they went, actually, I don't think they doubled it, but it was a substantial, may have been doubling in some instances, but I think overall it was just a substantial increase in the property requirements for the electorate to be allowed to vote, because in those days, pretty much everywhere in the world, poor people were not allowed to vote. It was illegal for poor people to vote. So you needed to have, a certain amount of property or a certain amount of wealth, or both. So, that was something. And just in general, they, helped protect the kind of, they created a constitution that was set up to protect like the eastern counties. Like the western counties also were not even within that, the western counties were given less of a vote. It was based on wealth, because there was said like based on the wealth of a county. I mean, straight up. I mean, this is based on kind of old classical, like Harringtonian, Ocean type doctrine that power follows wealth, power follows money, and if you're going to have, basically, if you allow democracy, you're going to get communism, is what pretty much all the classical scholars agreed on. So they tried to make sure that we would never get democracy, because they didn't want communism, because they, were largely land speculators, the ones who wrote history, the victors of those times. Anyway, so in Massachusetts, they created this terrible constitution. John Adams and his plutocratic friends in the East basically made a constitution that said that, first of all, votes, like your vote is like a half a vote if you live in the west of the state, and you can't even vote if you don't meet this even higher poverty qualification that they added during the revolution. So they basically, these were two of the main reasons that people started protesting against the Constitution. They started petitioning, and a lot of them wanted to emulate the Constitution of Vermont, which was based on the Constitution of Pennsylvania, which was the kind of radical, that was the state where the Westerners, like the more working class Scotch-Irish Appalachian people, actually had power, because the Quakers were basically knocked out of power in the East by being pacifists during a war. So that was kind of the birth of the modern leftism, you could say. It was the Pennsylvania Constitution, which basically gave the vote to everybody. I think you had to be a taxpayer. So there was still a stipulation, but it was the lowest stipulation of any place, like in the world. And then Vermont followed suit with basically the same constitution almost as Pennsylvania. And then the Westerners in Massachusetts, the Appalachian Presbyterians, Ulster Scots, and other people that were more working class that lived in the western part of the state, they wanted that same type of constitution for Massachusetts instead of the right-wing document that was put in by John Adams. And all of their petitions went unnoticed, and they were basically ignored. So ultimately they rose up, basically in the exact same spirit they had risen in, for all the battles of the revolution. But they rose up against, in this case, the state government, the Massachusetts state government, which had, put in a right-wing, anti-democratic constitution, which was less democratic than the colonial charter had been under the crown. And they were basically, they rose up, but they were basically brutally suppressed. They tried to basically liberate the munitions and the armory in that area, but somebody had been tipped off and it was under heavy guard, and so the guards basically shot all the all the Westerners were mostly unarmed, although there were a lot of officers among them, like a huge amount of officers of the American Revolution were among the rebels, including General Shays, who's the rebellion. It's generally named after Shays' Rebellion. But yeah, throughout every county almost in western Massachusetts, the most patriotic revolutionary officers and soldiers were the Shays rebels. They rose up for the same reasons, for freedom, because they saw that John Adams had just given them even less freedom than they had before they fought for all this. So anyway, this brought up a lot of fear in the East not just eastern Massachusetts, but the eastern United States, where the wealthy people lived, fear of socialism and communism and basically like land reform. Because even though that, I don't think land reform was a stated objective of the Shays rebels, but it had been an ongoing movement along the western frontier, generally of like pretty much every state, including Massachusetts, since earliest times. So, basically, the rich people said like they portrayed the Shays rebels as being communists and of trying to, you know, nationalize property and redistribute property. I'm not sure that that is at all accurate, but I think the fact that that was the reaction shows that, yeah, their experience of America and particularly the West showed them that that was an issue that was always simmering. So even if the Shays Rebellion was not specifically about that, it gave them misgivings about that, because that was, the source of their wealth was land. Land was the great wealth at that time. Like all the eastern seaboard people owned all the inland areas and were always selling it to each other and jockeying for, different land deals. So anyway, but just in general, this idea that poor people in the country could even have the nerve to rise up, just because their rights were like deprived against the rich, rulers of the East. And so that freaked everybody out in the East, or, all the power brokers. And it was basically the impetus for Alexander Hamilton calling the Constitutional Convention together as a way to make sure that the Easterners, the rich, are better coordinated so that they will never allow that to ever happen again. That if that, if there's ever a danger like that, they can basically either use the militias from other states, or they can use like a national army, which is, I think, basically what was later done against, well, probably in multiple instances, but it was certainly done in, I think it was done at the Battle of Blair Mountain in the 20th century against miners, striking miners in West Virginia. But I think it was also done against the Whiskey Rebellion, quote unquote, which happened, a decade or so after the Shays Rebellion. Maybe less than a decade. But anyway, the Whiskey Rebellion was similarly people in Western Pennsylvania rising up against the elites of the East and against the federal government in this case, because it was, I mean, you could say against Alexander Hamilton, because Alexander Hamilton had been, the mind behind the whiskey excise tax that was supposed to help save the government financially. And of course, as being a tax on alcoholic spirits, it, it could be kind of explained as somewhat of a vice tax, But one of the main problems with it, besides just maybe the problems with any excise tax, that it tends to be regressive, but that in a lot of the rural areas in America, whiskey was used as currency. Like there was a lot of places where, you know, the excess corn and grain, whatever, that couldn't go to harvest, that couldn't go to market, or, you know, couldn't be eaten, would have to be turned into whiskey. Like, I mean, there was maybe not even a way to keep a lot of the produce for much longer than that anyway. So it was like a kind of portable, like it was just a very central part of commerce and life in a lot of the rural areas. And it was much cheaper because, you know, like obviously if you go to a place where everybody distills whiskey, like it's going to be cheaper, you know, especially if it's like way across the other side of the state from, you know, Philadelphia, where there's money. You know, like if it's basically a rural, relatively poor area, so, and yet the tax was like the same level for every, like the way it was assized or whatever, like they were taxing them at the same level, I believe, in like the middle of Pennsylvania as they were taxing them in Philadelphia or New York City, where, I mean, whiskey was a lot more expensive in Philadelphia and New York City because it was often somebody had brought it from these inland farming districts, and just in general, things were more expensive in those places because people had more money. In a lot of the western parts of the country, like people literally didn't have money, so all they would have as currency would be things like whiskey. So anyway, this became a problem because, you know, a lot of the people were still suffering from the war. They were still suffering from the collapse of the continental currency, and they and the people who were the most poor and hurting the most tended to be in the West, in the inland rural parts of America. So they were disproportionately hit by this tax. Basically, you know, they were paying for far beyond what like the whiskey was actually worth in those counties. And so they rose up, and, you know, basically Hamilton himself, I believe, joined the army. I don't know if it could have been just militias, but it was definitely militias from a bunch of different states, and I think possibly a federal army force as well, including Hamilton and George Washington, to put down these, you know, poor people. And these were the poor people who had, together with the ones in Western Massachusetts, had made the revolution possible. You know, like those two areas, like Western Massachusetts and Western Pennsylvania, had supplied like the strongest forces basically for the revolution. So, and a lot of the people who rose